Next, from Springfield, State Senator Jason Barickman holds a press conference discussing lessons learned from the audit of former Governor Quinn's now defunct Neighborhood Recovery Initiative program and how Illinois can work to prevent future abuses of state funds. This runs about 20 minutes.
As many of you recall, last summer we spent a considerable amount of time reviewing what was known as the NRI audit. This was the scathing audit issued by Illinois Auditor General Bill Holland in his office. Our review of that audit, you may remember as well, was interrupted multiple times as a result of several criminal investigations into the NRI program. Regardless, the reason we're here today is to finish the job and to really close the loop on what comes of this NRI audit. Our goal is to make sure this type of waste and abuse of taxpayer dollars doesn't happen again. What we learned from the audit was that this program was a wasteful, ineffective, failed attempt to reduce crime in the city of Chicago. After tens of millions of taxpayer dollars were spent, we don't think that crime was reduced as a result of the program. I think many people question the legitimacy of this program. Some called it a political slush fund as a result of the timing of the program being launched just prior to Governor Quinn's election campaign or election night. The recommendations that we're putting forward here today are a result of the countless hours put in by the Audit Commission members themselves, certainly the fine work that was done by Auditor General Bill Holland and his expert staff, as well as the recommendations that they've made through the audit. And what we're proposing is simple but effective solutions that will make sure this type of abuse does not happen again, and attempts to protect the integrity of the many good not-for-profit organizations that operate around our state and provide services in communities around our state. So we try to do really three things here. The first is that we will propose to limit constitutional officers' ability to hand out goodies before an election. Many question the $50 million announcement that was made in the weeks leading up to that November 2010 election between Pat Quinn and Bill Brady. So we limit the ability of constitutional officers to hand out those types of goodies just before an election. The second thing is we close the loophole that became evident as a result of the review of the audit. Auditor General Bill Holland repeatedly questioned the Governor Quinn's attempts to move money around fiscal year restraints. This was an abuse that attempted to bypass the legislative budgeting process, and so we're going to close the loophole. And then the third area is, and if you remember, there were all these questions raised in the audit, media coverage of the program that suggested that Chicago City aldermen had influence in the process lacked oversight and accountability, and that there were even qualified providers who were ignored so that less than objective decisions could be made with how taxpayer money was spent. So we worked with with GOMB and are proposing a series of revisions to the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act, referred to as GATA, which I can go to, with any depth if others are interested. But the conclusion of all of this, and I think one of the takeaways, is that many of us who spent countless hours reviewing this program certainly share the concern of many who are concerned about violence throughout every community in this state. What we learned, though, is that this program was just an absolute failure. It did not address crime in the city of Chicago. It lacked the oversight that was necessary of any program that is spending tens of millions of taxpayer dollars. And so the hope is that through this legislation, regardless of whether you've got a Republican or a Democrat governor, This legislation will hopefully prevent the abuse that's occurred before. And from taxpayers' perspective, we hope to begin to restore some of their confidence in the government that is overseeing these types of programs, so that taxpayers have some restored confidence and we begin to restore the trust that they have in the government that serves them. So I'm joined today by Senator Darren LaHood. And Darren, do you want to say a few comments?
Yeah,
Sure.
Thank you, Senator Barickman. Darren LaHood, State Senator of the 37th District. I also serve on the Audit Commission with Senator Barickman and a number of others. I also, by way of background, was a state and federal prosecutor. And I would just say, echoing the comments of Senator Barickman, in looking at this program and $50 million that was spent here, as taxpayers and as legislators, in looking at how we fix this problem, obviously the Auditor General came forth. We have the audit now, and how do we make government and this program more effective, efficient, accountable, and ethically sound? And looking at it through that prism of the recommendations that Senator Barickman has put forth, that's what our goal is here, to make sure this does not happen again. Part of what we do in prosecution is deter this kind of behavior in the future. That's part of what we're doing here, is make sure that we deter this type of behavior that went on at the constitutional level from the governor and the staff there. But clearly it was a failure. Clearly it did not fix the problem that it was trying to do, and it was done for political purposes. In terms of cleaning up our image in Illinois, putting more transparency into state government, that's what this legislation does. And hopefully we can learn from this audit what Bill Howland put forth, and we can get this legislation passed. And I look forward to working with all of my colleagues, both Republican and Democrat, to get this passed.
Thanks, Darren. Questions?
Jason, would this have applied to what's going on with the College of DuPage and the stories coming out of Chicago Public Schools that there's a $20 million no-bid contract that was awarded?
You know, Terry, the impetus of this is not that situation, although I'm certainly well aware of it. I can't really break down what impact this legislation would specifically have on COD and the actions we've seen there. I know there's other proposals floating around the State House on that, but I can't speak specifically to what this would do to address some of those situations.
Let's put it this way, over what political units of government would the bill apply?
So this is, you know, the blackout period, I think, might be one of the areas that your question is pertinent to. The blackout period that we're suggesting is a 60-day period of time that puts a prohibition on constitutional officers making certain announcements of new state programs and grants in those 60 days prior to an election.
Senator, is there any provision for recovery of some of these funds?
You know, part of the amendments to GATA, the Grant Accountability Transparency Act, is to create stronger teeth for the state to claw back some of these funds. First of all, to stop them in the process. So if you find out there's bad actors, or you find out that a grantee is not complying with the terms of a grant, we're enabling the administration or the agency to stop the grant in it midstream, but we're also giving the agency more teeth to claw back some of these dollars as well.
I don't have the bill in front of me, but can you talk about this blackout period? What if there's a disaster that, you know, lawmakers and the governor get together and need to put something, some money into some program? What are the provisions?
Yeah, I think, you know, the legislature can always act with an amount of reasonableness to address if there's a natural disaster or otherwise. So this isn't meant to talk to that piece. It's meant to address the politicization of the announcement of some of these grants and programs in those weeks before an election. Historically, that's been the problem, and that's what this is designed to address.
Just new programs, or what about handing out money for new bridges and roads, university facilities?
Yeah, now I don't have the language right in front of me, Kurt, but we can get that. But, you know, it's the goodies that we've seen prior governors announce. It's a new grant. Generally, it's a new grant or it's a new program in the weeks leading up to an election that I think the public questions as whether it's a legitimate or a political statement coming out of the constitutional officer. Well, it's a law. You know, we'd expect any of the constitutional officers to abide by the law.
Is it a blanket, or is it only just before an election? I mean, wouldn't it apply to all people getting state representation?
So this is, you know, what we pulled from, which is somewhat analogous, is the blackout period that exists for legislators today. And we're simply trying to learn from, I think, the productive restriction that we see exists on legislators. And so it's 60 days, Terry, prior to an election for constitutional officers.
So it sounds like you're less worried about the big cardboard check presentation than you're worried about someone making a unilateral sweep, diverting funds, creating a new program on election eve.
Well, we're worried about things like this. I mean, this was a you know, NRI in August through October of 2010 was a brand new program that had no you know, inclusion in that fiscal year's budget. The governor just went out and said, we're going to start this $50 million, you know, over $50 million program. And that's what this is trying to address, is that type of a situation.
Do you think this kind of takes away from the power of the almighty incumbent?
Well, you know, the hope is that it takes away from the abuse that some incumbents have used in the past.
Senator LaHood, can you, as a prosecutor, how would this strengthen your hand, and how would you go about prosecuting perhaps a case, if that's a fair question? How would this law impact the ability of prosecutors to hold grant recipients accountable?
Well, I think a couple things. First of all, this clarifies the law in the sense that it lays out definitive rules in terms of compliance, what you can and can't do. It seems to me when we were going through this process, there was lots of mixed opinion for what the governor could or could not do, who was in charge, who was doing what direction they were taking. I think this cleans that up, Terry, and puts in place. So now you know where that line is of not to cross. And so making sure that people are well aware of that, and when and if that's crossed, I think prosecutors will have a better idea of the framework and what government officials can and cannot do. So in some ways, I think it strengthens their hand because it'll be fairly clear when you cross that line in terms of the blackout date, in terms of the authority of who's making decisions on this, the way that I look at the legislation. So I think it's a win-win in terms of for taxpayers and the public, and then also for prosecutors to clearly define the law and be able to lay out the elements of what you need to prosecute somebody.
You know, on NRI, one of the issues that came out before the committee were some of the people were bringing home documents as if they were, and holding them. This may not have anything to do with this proposal, but is anything being done to say who controls the documents that are assigned to a grant, and whether someone who works there can bring them home and destroy them, a la Hillary Clinton's recent exhibit? Or do we have any control of the documentation? Because as a prosecutor, you may need to have documents, or just to hold someone accountable for the expenditures.
So, you know, Terry, I'm not sure if you're referencing, you know, over the summer when we were really performing the review, there was multiple requests for documents to be turned over. Some of the witnesses had retained documents after they left state employment. I think, you know, while as members of the Audit Commission, I don't think we focused on that issue, although there were circulating, I think, attorneys, members of the staff and otherwise, who told us that retention of documents by a non-state employee may violate an existing law. But, you know, our focus was really on the grant-making process here. And to your earlier question to Senator LaHood, you know, remember that almost as soon as this program was announced in that fall of 2010, it wasn't just Republicans who questioned it. There were leading Chicago Democrats who questioned the timing of the announcement and the legitimacy of the program, but there was nothing anyone could do about it because the law did not prohibit Governor Quinn at the time from making those announcements. So this simply addresses that.
There's a bit of a message here too to the chief executive, regardless of his party. If you're going to go on a $50 million jaunt, you might want to check in with the legislature and respect the budget.
Yeah, part of this effort is to regain that balance that is supposed to exist between the legislature and the executive branch, especially as it pertains to taxpayer money that's being spent. And a significant point, though it's technical, a significant point made by the Auditor General is that the actions of former Governor Quinn really shirked the legislative control of the budgeting process. And I think every lawmaker ought to take pause in that and consider the importance of our role in providing oversight to the governor's office and the way in which those tax dollars are being spent.
Is there some kind of punishment built into the law right now, whether it's a fine or jail time or anything like that?
Well, I am certain that there are, there's penalties for violating the laws that exist on the books. I don't know all of the penalties to this. But hopefully, we don't need to get there in the future. Hopefully, by having this law, it's a clear message to our constitutional officers that these actions are not permitted. We've made it clear, if we pass this legislation into law, we're making it clear that the legislature thinks that those actions ought to be done in the future.
I'm trying to, so it's a 60-day blackout before you can't, as an executive, as the governor, who's ever governor or constitutional officer, couldn't give the grant 60 days before. But what if they just plan ahead and do it 90 days before? And then relative to complying with these restrictions in your proposal, they're like, well, we're working on them. But really, they're getting their troops out in the field using state monies to campaign and saying, hey, by the time we get you the paperwork and the documentation and all that, it'll be after the election.
Well, ultimately, voters have to weigh in on the actions that people take in public office. And so all the restrictions in the world, I suppose, aren't going to stop the most egregious of bad actors who may want to waste taxpayer dollars. But what we're trying to do, we're learning from the audit and the clear deficiencies that exist in the law today. And we're proposing today what I think are really simple and common sense steps to address those egregious violations. If there's someone in the future who wants to find more ways to spend taxpayer dollars, unfortunately, bad actors will be what they'll be, and they may try to find their way, but hopefully the legislature will continue to voice our concerns in these types of decisions.
Speaking of the legislature, do you think that you got the votes for this right now?
Obviously, we're going to work through the legislative process. My Democratic colleagues that serve on the Audit Commission are well aware of the findings of last year's audit. They've all been provided copies of the legislation that I propose. I think everyone was troubled with what we saw over the summer last year, and I hope that we can move this forward quickly in a bipartisan manner. Thank you. All right, thank you.